At this point, we'll take just a moment. So what all was it really that God promised Abraham? It's an amazing number of things that God promises to Abraham. You'll often hear people summarize the promise to Abraham under 3 points. They'll say there's land promise, a seed promise, and a spiritual promise. And that's true. But I want to say a bit more than that, because there are quite a number of aspects to this promise. There are just a lot of things that God says He's going to do for and to Abraham and to his descendants. And so I want to make a list again. My students get used to learning lists because that's the way I test them. I'm always asking them, give me a list of this and a list of that and so on. So I make a lot of my lectures like that. A list of this and a list of that. Okay, well, what we're going to look at now is what was it that God promised? He didn't just say, I'm going to love you and be nice to you. I mean, there's some very specific things that pointed to how the story of the Bible was going to unfold and how God was going to bring salvation to all the nations of the earth. And so I'm going to suggest the first thing that He promised him, that's mentioned right here, is He promised him this land, the land of Canaan. He says, go forth from your country, from your relatives, your father's house, to the land that I will show you. And I think that's probably mentioned first, because here in the next several chapters of the Old Testament, especially Exodus and Leviticus and so on, that's going to be the first part of this promise that's focused on, is God bringing Abraham down to this land and then how his descendants eventually come into possession of this land that God has chosen for them to live in as God unfolds this plan of salvation for mankind, for all the nations. So first He promises to give him the land that, as we say, some people today call it the Holy Land, the land of Palestine, the land of Israel, that small country over there in the Middle East, the land that God gave to Abraham. Second place, He says, I will make you a great nation. And you think about God fulfilling that promise to Abraham. He would make him a great nation. Let me illustrate it this way. In Abraham's day, there were a number of great nations. In Abraham's day, Sumer was a great civilization. And Akkad was a great nation. How many of you know much of anything about Sumer or Akkad? Who's Sumer? Who's Akkad? Well, they were the headliners. They were the United States and the major powers of that day and time. And there were many others as well that people have long since forgotten. But here we are, 4,000 years after Abraham. Abraham lived about as far on the other side of Christ as we live on this side. He lived about 2000 BC. And here we are 4,000 years later, and all over the world, people know that race of people that descended from Abraham. And so just on the purely physical level, we can think about the greatness of the nation. Now, on the purely physical level, the nation that descended from Abraham has never been the most numerous people, but we're going to look at a passage later on because God's going to expand on that, and He's going to talk about how many of them there were, and we're going to talk about how that numerous great nation of people that have descended from Abraham even goes beyond just the Jewish people themselves, those that are biologically his descendants. But He said He was going to make him a great nation, and we're certainly, at least on just the initial level, aware of how God has fulfilled that in the Jewish people that we still 4,000 years later today know. There's not any nation 4,000 years ago that still exists. Somebody might say Egypt. Well, only in a sense. Egypt still bears the name, but the country of Egypt today is not populated by the same people that populated it back in Abraham's day. Back in Abraham's day, it was populated by Egyptians. Now it's populated by Arabs, not by Egyptians. Oh, we call them Egyptians because it's the same country, and the same name. But there's no other nation from the time of Abraham that is still in existence, save those descendants of his. Now, next thing that we look at here, He says, I will make you, in verse 2, a great nation. I will bless you. And He says, I will make your name great. Number 3, a great name. And once again, I want you to think about this. Abraham, famous name. Think about who some of the famous names were in Abraham's day. I named some of them. Lipit Ishtar. Everybody knows about Lipit Ishtar, right? No, you never heard of him. Well, he was famous in Abraham's day. Abraham was unheard of. Abraham was an unknown in his own day. But there were many famous people who were long since forgotten. But here we are 4,000 years later, and everybody knows who Abraham is. As a matter of fact, You know that Abraham is one of the most common names in the world today? I'm not sure it's the most common, but it is one of the most common. And you say, well, we don't have that many people named Abraham in our society, Abe or Abraham. Well, maybe not, but, if you step into Islamic society, every other person is named Abraham. They pronounce it a little bit differently. They pronounce it Ibrahim, but it's the same name. And it is one of the most common names in the world today. And it is a name that is preserved precisely because of the Bible account of Abraham and the promise and the things that God did for him. So I will make your name great. Abraham's the only person from that day and age that is still remembered. Some people remember a famous Babylonian by the name of Hammurabi, made a law code, lived about the same time. Actually lived about 300 years after Abraham, but still, at least that's kind of in the same ballpark back there. But nobody would pay any attention or care anything about Hammurabi, except for the fact that people got all excited because here's somebody from Abraham's day. And so God has indeed again fulfilled that. Then he goes on to say, in the fourth place, he says, I will bless those who bless you, bless your friends, one might say, and curse your enemies. And of course, this goes back to this basic point about blessing and curse. God is basically saying that salvation is going to be found in those that align themselves with Abraham. And to be under God's curse is going to be found in those who turn against Abraham and his people. And we'll see how that is true as the story of the Bible unfolds as well. On a more immediate level, God's promising to protect Abraham. And we'll see that in some of the subsequent chapters, how God protects Abraham and those who are friends to him, and how God protects him from those who are his enemies and curses them. And then, a fifth thing that he says to him right here at the end of verse 3, which I usually try to identify as really, it seems to me, the key element in the whole promise. He says, in you, I'm going to say in him, in Abraham, all the nations of the earth are to be blessed. All nations blessed. Now, God didn't choose Abraham just because he wanted to do something nice for Abraham. We read about this promise to Abraham and the blessing that God gives to Abraham. Yes, it does involve God's loving and protecting and caring for Abraham. But that's not why God chose Abraham, just to do something good for him. It's not just Abraham that needs hope. It's all the world that needs hope. It's not just Abraham that needs salvation. It's all the world that needs salvation. God didn't choose Abraham just to save Abraham. God chose Abraham and his descendants as the means to save all nations, because sin has affected all nations. Remember we were talking last week about the consequence of sin. We made the point that sin is universal. All men have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And so as God begins to unfold his promise, his plan of salvation here, it is from the very beginning identified as a promise to bring a blessing to all nations. And it's a great mistake to think that this was just a promise to bless Abraham and the Jews. It was not even primarily a promise to bless Abraham and the Jews. It was primarily a promise to use them as the means for bringing a blessing to all mankind. That was the first and initial, you might say, statement of the promise to Abraham.